For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal. I am Surya Gangadharan. This evening, we are going to take a look at Ukraine. We're going to cut through all the noise and the clutter and the propaganda and give you a sense of what actually is happening there and why it's happening. First of all, I have a small graphic here for you that I'd like you to take a look at. This is basically sums up our show on Ukraine. That all the talk and the threats of war are largely for effect. Neither the US nor Russia nor Europe want war. In fact, there are divergent approaches to Ukraine, and there is absolutely no plan for admitting Ukraine into NATO. So that's the basis of this chat we're having this evening. And my guest is Ambassador P S Raghavan. You all met him before. He was chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. He was our ambassador in Moscow, and he's going to answer our questions this evening. Ambassador, welcome. Glad to have you again.
Thank you very much. Very good to be with you again.
Sir, this prolonged saber rattling over Ukraine, the media, the matter, how it plays out. One gets the impression that war clouds are on the high, but is this actually the case?
Yeah, this is a very peculiar development which has suddenly happened over the last month or so. Saber rattling, you mentioned, it's absolutely saber rattling. It is rhetoric. It is all kinds of conspiracy theories and false flag operations, etc., that's going on. But if you take a step back and see where we got, how we got to where we are, in the last 6 months, you've had an extraordinary series of engagement between the US and Russia. In June, President Biden had a meeting with President Putin, and he said very clearly that his objective was to sort of establish relations of stability with Russia so that they could cooperate in solving global issues. The subtext was very clear. President Biden wanted to concentrate on his domestic agenda, which is, COVID, economy, infrastructure, etc. And externally, he wanted to focus on the principal challenge for America, which was China. So essentially, the idea was you sort of move from acrimony to some kind of a modus vivendi with Russia to be able to focus more entirely on China. And this is something that President Putin and Russia welcomed very greatly. For a long time, their complaint was that they were not being taken seriously by America.
Yeah.
And now they were being taken seriously by America. They were being treated as an equal power. And then you see between June and now, probably you've had more substantive interaction between the US and Russia than has happened in the 6 years before that. You've had the Undersecretary of State Nuland went there. The chiefs of General Staff had a 6-hour meeting in Helsinki. The CIA chief, who's also a former ambassador to Russia and a former US Deputy Secretary of State, he made a 2-day visit to Russia. You've had talks which commenced on strategic stability, which is basically another word for arms control. And then, you used to hear about this ransomware and cyber attacks on the US by rogue elements from Russia. Their dialogue has virtually stopped this. You don't hear any more about ransomware. So, and then, of course, the US lifted sanctions on this gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. Of course, that was a concession to Germany, but it was actually a concession to Russia. So you add all this, and then, in the discussions, they said that we will now cooperate in seeing how we can resolve the Ukraine issue on the basis of the Minsk agreements. You can keep adding various elements to it. So there was a very intensive dialogue which was going on. And what actually is the background to the current military buildup? When an Assistant Secretary of State from the US, Dawn Fried, I think was her name, went to Moscow, she was given draft agreements by Russia for a Russia-US agreement and a Russia-NATO agreement, which incorporated security guarantees which Russia would need if it has to have a stable relationship with America. And then suddenly, these reports came of Russia's troop buildup, and then, of course, that Russia is planning an invasion, and then the Ukrainian president said that a coup is being planned against him, and then you have all kinds of stories of various stories. The latest one is that Russia is planning to put a puppet government in Ukraine. How and why has not been explained. So, there has been a media frenzy, there has been various conspiracy theories. All of this has led to what you see on the TV screens today.
So, all this noise that's happening over Ukraine, is it being done to undermine Biden's initiative? Is it being done at home?
See, one has to accept that when President Biden took the step to normalize, if you like, relations with Russia, it was, one might call it, against the run of play. Because the acrimony against Russia was real. The mood, there's a bipartisan support, or rather bipartisan opposition to Russia, and in particular to President Putin within the US, whether you talk about the Congress, whether you talk about the establishment, the security establishment, everywhere. There is a very strong feeling that in spite of the fact that there is now a sentiment building up in America against China, there is a very strong feeling in America that Russia still remains enemy number one. So President Biden had to actually overcome a lot of skepticism and a lot of opposition within his own country, within his own establishment to this move. And of course, if you look further up, there are many in Europe who do not wish to see a US-Russia rapprochement in this form. They would like US to keep up the heat on Russia, particularly the Baltic countries and the Central European countries. So there are a number of forces here, and of course, Ukraine itself is very apprehensive that any kind of a US-Russia deal would actually compromise its own interests in terms of, regaining Crimea, regaining the eastern part of the country, which is the moment occupied by rebels. So you have a number of naysayers, and of course, within Russia also, the military establishment, the security establishment, is not attuned to rapprochement with the US. So all of this means that you will constantly see various kinds of provocations, various kinds of local actions, rogue operations, as I said, false flag operations, and so on. Which, when you add to that the decades of mistrust and suspicion that exists between Russia and the US, it takes very little to arouse this suspicion, and for the US side to feel that the Russians are planning something underhand, and vice versa. So there is opposition, and there is opposition which President Biden, to his credit, has been trying to carry Europe along with him. Immediately after his summit with Putin also, he did a very extensive dialogue with all the European countries. He tried to get NATO behind him, he tried to get EU behind him, and also to get them all behind him in identifying China as the challenge number one. So all of this has also been going on. But as I said, in this kind of a tinderbox situation, you only require one miscalculation to take tensions over the edge.
Would you say that the two sides have made some progress, Russia and the US?
No, as I said, they have made huge progress. If you just turn the curtain and look behind this aggressive posture, as I said, firstly, even the recognition of Russia as an equal partner is itself for Russia. It's what Russia has been craving for the last many years after President Obama dismissed it as some kind of a regional power. So even dealing with the US on an equal footing. The other thing is that, look, Russia would like, as President Biden has been saying, Russia would like an engagement with the West to resume in order to rebuild its economy, in order to have reduce its dependence on China. As President Biden said, Russia does not want to be squeezed by China. And if Russia has to emerge on the scene as a great power again, it needs to have relations both with the West and with China on an equal footing. And this is what I think this discussion were leading towards. They're basically a geopolitical rebalancing that President Biden set in motion in June. Russia's point now, if you were to ask me why is Russia making all these demands at the time when other progress is being made on other issues, I think it is Russia's response to the American desire for geopolitical rebalancing. Yes, Russia is all for this geopolitical rebalancing that puts it on an equal plane with America. But the point that President Putin is making is that if you want such a rebalancing and if you want it to be sustainable, you have to keep in mind our security requirements as well. You've had a situation now where NATO and American allies have been applying pressure on Russia all across its periphery, whether you look at the Baltic Sea, whether you look at the Black Sea, with the NATO deployments in the NATO deployments in countries around Russia, and then you have actions in efforts to restrain Russian influence in West Asia, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia. So the point is that you need what Russia is saying is that you need a modus vivendi where you respect our security interests, you respect our national interests, and then we have an equilibrium on the basis of which we work together to solve other global issues. And so this entire face-off, this is the backdrop to it, this is the subtext to it.
And you believe that this is going forward?
Look, I think it should go forward. The objective reality is that both sides want to get together and both sides want to reach agreement. But in politics and in international affairs, sometimes the objective falls by the wayside and the immediate political pressures overtake you. You know, it's a game of chicken they're playing now. And a little rogue action here, a little false flag action here, a little suspicion here can tip things over the edge. We should hope very strongly that doesn't happen. And of course, you know, people talk about Putin wanting to invade Ukraine. Why would he want to invade Ukraine? What will he achieve by it? You know, the only thing that the Russians wanted at the time when they took Crimea 7 years ago was that if they could have, together with the separatists, created a land border, a land corridor from the Russian mainland to Crimea through Mariupol, that would have been very good for them. But the Minsk agreements at that time stopped it. Today, they cannot do that. And today, you know, going to war with Ukraine means uniting Europe against Russia. Today, there are parts of Europe which want rapprochement with Russia. In fact, the EU foreign ministers are meeting today to discuss sanctions against Russia. And what they're likely to say is that let's not hurry into sanctions before Russia does anything. You don't want to upset all that by actually getting them together and getting them against you. So that doesn't make sense either. I mean, President Putin invading Ukraine doesn't make sense for him.
So how serious are these reports about Ukraine being admitted into NATO, or the prospect of, you know, Ukraine's admission into NATO?
See, this Ukraine NATO membership is actually one unwise creation of America in 2008. In 2008, actually, in the Bucharest NATO summit, the US persuaded NATO to issue a statement saying Ukraine and Georgia, we welcome Ukraine and Georgia's aspirations to join NATO, or some words to that effect. France and Germany had opposed it even at that time. Everyone knows that Europe knows perfectly well that this is a red line for Russia like no other red line. You know, if you look at the map, you understand why. Ukraine is a flat land which has provided the ground for invasions into Russia through history. It's a porous border which gives access to the Russian plains. It gives access to the restive South Caucasus republics, the Caucasian republics of Russia. It gives access to hydrocarbon deposits. It gives access to Moscow. So Russia cannot afford to have NATO in Ukraine, or Ukraine in NATO. Equally, you know, the Crimea. Why did they take Crimea? Crimea is has the ports on the Black Sea from which Russia organizes its maritime defense in this area and projects its power into Europe and Asia. So again, NATO in Sevastopol, which is the port in Crimea, is simply unimaginable for Russia. Besides, of course, other reasons of cultural links and Ukraine's economic attractiveness as a partner for Russia, etc., etc. Same with Georgia. Georgia actually borders the Chechnya, Dagestan, and the other restive Caucasian republics. And you cannot afford to have NATO there fomenting trouble. So these are republics which actually Russia cannot afford to have NATO, but they are also not in joining NATO quite as yet. The fact is that there are two breakaway republics from Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, whose independence Russia has recognized. No one else has done so. Russian troops are there. Similarly, Russia is sitting in Crimea, which is recognized otherwise as a part of Ukraine. So as long as this happens, NATO is not in a position to admit either of these two countries. Also, NATO has been telling Ukraine that yes, you can come to join us, but first you must root out the evil of corruption in your system. NATO also has governance standards, political standards, economic standards, and neither Ukraine nor Georgia at the moment meet them, and NATO has been quite publicly saying so. But when Russia says that they should not join NATO, NATO immediately responds saying, who are you to say that? It is their right and it is our right. So you will never get a formal agreement from NATO or from any country for that matter, or the US, that these countries will not join NATO. You have to have a tacit understanding that their joining NATO is very far away. But you have to find, to satisfy Russia, you have to find a formulation that reflects this tacit understanding, and you should stop from time to time saying from the rooftops that Ukraine will join NATO or Georgia will join NATO. So again, when you're looking at a solution to this, where do you see the way out of this? You need to find a diplomatic formulation that expresses this fact about Georgia and Ukraine. You need to find a diplomatic formulation that incorporates the path to a solution to the Ukraine impasse, the Minsk agreements. How do you implement it? Though Ukraine at the moment is against implementing of it. So you need to find some kind of a face-saving diplomatic agreement on how you find a pathway out of the Ukraine crisis. And the last issue which is today at stake is security guarantees. Now that is something that is less problematic, at least conceptually. Both NATO, European countries and Russia would be willing to negotiate some kind of an agreement that limits weapons deployment of weapons that are aiming at each other, lethal weapons, that some kind of an agreement on how military exercises can be restrained. You have clear notification of military exercises so that you don't arouse the threat perception of the other country. These are the three issues that are there. And there is a way to solve them. And in fact, as we speak, while all this is going on, there is also dialogue. You have meetings planned. Of course, the Secretary of State had meetings in Ukraine and Russia. There are other meetings planned, and they've also said that if necessary, President Biden, President Putin will have a meeting. So there is behind all this some diplomatic activities that are going on.
So let's come to India now. We've been watching this drama play out for some time. I know we don't have a stake in this, but we would obviously like some deal of some kind between the Russians and the Americans, isn't it?
For two things. One is that this starts the process of an accommodation between Russia and the US, which gives Russia the space to develop some kind of an autonomy from China, which is obviously in our interest. And second, it takes some of the pressure off us from the US on India-Russia relations, which, as you know, when the S-400 and with CATSA and the others, if Russia and the US reach accommodation, obviously the pressure on us to develop relations with Russia is taken off. You come back to a situation which existed in the early 2000s, where we developed relations with US, with Russia, and with Europe on relatively independent tracks, though of course there are interconnections, where we strengthened our strategic partnership with all three. That is the kind of situation that suits us, that suits our strategic autonomy, and that also suits our global ambitions. And to look at the flip side of it, if this fails, if this degenerates into, even if not war, mutual recrimination and then sanctions on Russia, worsened US-Russia relations, who benefits from it? China benefits from it. And who loses from it? India loses from it. So India has a very strong stake in the dialogue succeeding, in both these sides retreating from the brink and letting reason dominate over prejudice and animosity.
And you expect that some kind of a deal could be worked out? I mean, I know this is a bit of soothsaying here, but
No. No. See, to expect it is asking for too much. As I said, objective logic, strategic logic dictates that they should retreat from the brink and do a deal. The deal is there. As I
yeah,
said, there are these three subjects. There is this Ukraine, there is NATO, and there is security guarantees. There is a clear path forward for mutually beneficial agreement to be reached here, or shall we say, in some cases, face-saving agreement. In some cases, kicking the can very delicately down the ground to deal with their future. Well, diplomacy is a combination of all these, and I think there is ground for that. There is more ground for this today than there was before June. The logic of that interaction from June to now between the US and Russia definitely has created sufficient ground for a deal that can get out of the present crisis. Whether that will happen or not depends on, as I said, everything in international affairs doesn't happen on logic. Sometimes immediate political expediency scores over long-term strategic logic.
yeah.
And that is something that you can never predict.
So looking forward to whatever happens on the Russia-Ukraine front. Hopefully, Ukraine doesn't lose out. I would presume that somewhere a deal would see them on the back foot.
You see, the question of Ukraine losing out or not losing out, it's a very difficult question to answer. What is losing out?
Yeah.
Events have happened. Events have happened from 2014 onwards. Actually, you see, it is possible to argue, if you look at the what ifs of history, it is possible to argue, in 2008 in Bucharest, when George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice, in fact, pushed NATO to agree to invite or to say that, Georgia and Ukraine were aspirants with NATO. President Putin at that time warned George Bush that, look, if ever NATO comes to Ukraine, we will take Crimea in 2008. And by the way, the US ambassador in Moscow at that time is the CIA chief today, William Burns, who is the man who conveyed President Putin's message to George W. Bush. Now, you see, events then took a turn in 2014 where the new government came in Ukraine and the new government said that we want to join the EU and NATO, and Russia felt threatened enough to occupy Crimea.
Yeah.
You can't turn the clock back. This has happened. Now, today, to dislodge Russia from Crimea, I think is very, very difficult, though Ukraine would like that to happen. So when you talk about Ukraine losing out, I think we have to see what is the possible thing today. Everybody, the US and its allies, say that we are committed to the unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine, which means Russia get out of Crimea. But you think Russia get out of Crimea? You think you can make Russia get out of Crimea? Especially when its core national interests are involved there? It's not going to be possible.
Yeah.
The other thing is that arising out of that, the separatist movement started. Now you have the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement was negotiated with France, Germany, Ukraine, Russia. It has been endorsed by the UN Security Council. It's a UN Security Council approved agreement. Now that agreement says that you will have an autonomous eastern province in Ukraine. You will have the Ukrainian constitution will have to respect that, and then elections will be held, and therefore Ukraine will become a federal structure with the eastern part autonomous. Now, many people will say that this amounts to a Russian protectorate in eastern Ukraine. You can look at it that way. On the other hand, you can look at it as today, the one formula for peace in Ukraine, there is no other formula. As President Putin likes to say, that's the only game in town as of today.
Yeah.
So you have to live with the art of the possible.
Yeah.
And you can't turn the clock back.
So on that note, Ambassador Raghavan, thank you. Pleasure talking to you and great perspective. Thanks very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks.
And for all of you out there who are following us on our YouTube channel, please subscribe. Keep coming to us with your comments, questions, and observations. We welcome them. Do follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and other social media. Thank you. Good night.